Yes, it's just 1 minute after 11, so it's within my punctuality personal guidelines. That might need some verification. My name is Mike Jennings, and I have the honour and the privilege of being the chair of TASC. Not the chair of today's meeting. I'll come to that distinguished role in a minute. But firstly, I want to thank you all very sincerely for your attendance. And absolutely, this is the sort of thing that people might say, but it's absolutely genuine. The buzz that I have got since I came in the door is about the quality of the attendance today, right? So you should all feel sufficiently flattered. And I suspect that has a lot to do with the quality of the panel which has been assembled for today's event. But I think, with the possible exception of myself, who is a complete and utter amateur in this regard, we do have the ingredients for a very, very fruitful and worthwhile discussion this morning, and I want to thank you in advance for facilitating that, and indeed, as I'm sure you will, for contributing to it. I am not the person to introduce the individual members of the panel and speakers. I'm going to leave that to Kevin. But it is my great pleasure, for reasons which I want to elaborate on, to introduce Kevin Cardiff as the chair of this morning's proceedings. I'm sure every one of you is aware of the fact that Kevin is a former General Secretary of the Department of Finance. And my personal engagement with him, apart from my awareness of him prior to that, was the time that he spent with us as a member of the board of TASC. And I just, I don't see Kevin as often as I would like to, but I try, but I don't try. I insist every time in saying him, thanking him for the contribution he made in that role, which will come as no surprise to any one of you. And just to say, Kevin, I know what your business diary is like, retired years. I know, should I say that? I meant to say my eye, but there you go. It's my upbringing. Just to say, retired, yeah. Well, Kevin, if you're ever at a loose end, we would love to have you back on the board of TASC anytime, in any capacity, and would welcome it. I think you will agree, anybody who knows him would agree that, with my assessment, that Kevin is the epitome of what a good public servant should be. He's extremely hardworking. He's very conscientious. He's very open-minded.
He's conscious of time.
You got the wrong guy to open the meeting then, I can tell you, right? Yeah. It's a good job we've agreed that I'm not closing it either. People never get the last bus home. Very impertinent, tends to interrupt the speaker unnecessarily, but there you go. No, but seriously, and I think that so many of you are practitioners in this field of superannuation, pensions, and social welfare entitlements generally, and we would have met with Kevin, and I know that you would share my assessment of the style, the manner, and the behaviour that he brings to all such events. So, Kevin, I promise I'm now finishing, which means I've only got about 14 more paragraphs to go. Anyway, I'm about finishing up. I want to again thank you again, and thank you for your attendance, and I'll hand you over to Kevin to take it here. For the meeting, Michael.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm very flattered, but I didn't even recognise myself. This is in some ways a timely discussion, because auto-enrollment looks like it's actually about to happen, but it's also a very late discussion because it's been talked about for, well, frankly, as long as some of you older people have been working on pensions, which is a very long time. It is a miracle, really, that the public is unaware of how important, in terms of public policy, in terms of public finances, the pensions agenda is, and also of the enormous changes that have been made in the last 20 years, almost unnoticed. First, in terms of the public sector pensions agenda, where A lot is different now compared to the 1990s, when there was a very detailed examination of them. And also even in terms of the state pension, where a lot of changes have happened that don't affect most people, but do affect the balance of cost and benefit over the long term, and also the incentives for people in terms of how they engage with their working life and with their retirement future. But it's a bit like climate change. There is nothing that is urgent in pensions. There is nothing that cannot be put off for a year or 2 or 5, just like climate change. But just like climate change, every year that you put something off, every year that is lost, is an added cost that has to be met sometime in the future. And it is almost shameful that some of the people in this room have been having to say this for the last 30 years, say the same thing over and over, and thankfully, not everybody was not listening, and thankfully things are now moving on even a little bit further than they have, and that's a great testament to some of the people on the panel, even as to what they've done in the past. So we're going to hear it from the horse's mouth first. Tim Duggan, who's from the Department of Social Protection, who is deeply engaged in this agenda. He's going to tell us where we stand on the auto-enrollment process, where we're going next, and then we're going to have a little bit of debate, because not everybody thinks he's got it exactly right. There are seats up here if you want to make a quick dash while Tim gets settled.
Yeah, because I feel like a priest looking at a bunch of people down the back. They're either there because they're not religious or because it's easier to pick somebody off with a rifle from a long distance. I'm not sure which it is. Anyway, good morning everyone. It's lovely to be here and nice to be in a packed room. Just a little bit of background. I think we all know why this is a thing at all, and that is we've had consistent under-coverage for decades of people with supplementary pensions, despite the fact that the state has provided very...
I'll just swap over a mic there.
So despite the fact that the state has provided very generous incentives through many decades at this juncture. So we know only about a third of people working in the private sector have got supplementary pensions, and that the bulk of those people are in the mid to high income bracket, which means that 2/3 of people do not have supplementary pensions at all, and they are in the low to middle income brackets in the main. Now, some people say that means they're going to be completely reliant on the state pension when they retire. I actually don't think that's a correct correlation. Lots of people have other asset bases, or will have other asset bases at a future point in their life, so they don't necessarily mean the same thing. But even so, 2/3 of people without a supplementary pension arrangement is a serious issue that needs to be contended with. And the same people that are not engaged are exactly the same people that are highly unlikely to engage, in the sense that they don't necessarily engage with financial products and financial markets. They don't necessarily understand it, and not only that, they have no real interest in engaging either. And consequently, you end up with this incredible inertia that we've had for the last 30, 40 years. And I suppose, in reality, a market failure. And that is what the government is trying to address with this auto-enrollment program. So a few little principles that we've always tried to work with as we've developed the design for this over the last number of years. The first is that because of the cohort of people that it's being aimed at, it cannot be complicated. It has to be relatively easy to engage with and relatively easy to understand. Maybe not the entire machinery, but at least the main elements of it. And almost to the point that it doesn't need to be understood at all. So that's one of the principles we've always been working with. The second one is that it should not require any level of detailed knowledge. That people don't need to sit down and read big leaflets and try and understand new concepts or new ideas or anything like that. The third is that we should facilitate choice wherever we can, but we should never require it. Because otherwise, if you do, you're ignoring the fact that inertia has got us here in the first place. And so while we will do our damnedest to give people every opportunity that they might wish to have over the implementation of this, we will never require people to make any deliberate choices. So I've always said to the team, what I ultimately want is a situation where people, despite themselves, can actually sleepwalk into a good quality pension arrangement. One of the other big principles we've tried to live by in designing this is that the burden for everybody involved should be at the absolute minimum. And by that I mean, I've already explained how I don't think that individuals should have to engage hugely to get into a pension arrangement, but equally I don't think their employers should have to engage significantly to facilitate them getting into that pension arrangement. A lot of employers in Ireland are small or medium-sized and do not have the wherewithal, the bandwidth, the knowledge, or even the money to be engaging the level of expertise that would be required to help them establish supplementary arrangements for their workforces. So we have deliberately designed this to be as admin-free for employers as we think we can make it. And then the last thing is that because of that description of the cohort of people that I'm talking about, we feel that it's necessary to protect that group of people as best we can from the vagaries of the financial markets that engaging in AE will bring them to. And therefore, they can't know about investment portfolios and how that works and the issues with them. They can't know about the intricacies of pension management and how all of that works. And therefore, we feel it's necessary to have some buffer, some custodian between them and the industry that we're going to be compelling them to engage with. So then moving on to some of the actual design elements that have been talked about at length over the last year or so since the design was published. The first one is a state-run central processing authority. And lots of people have expressed various kinds of views on that. But I'll just explain some of the thinking behind it. The first is we do genuinely want to minimize the burden for everybody that's going to be involved in the delivery of this system. And the only way to do that is to have something looking after that burden, because that burden does exist. It doesn't go away just because I don't want it to be there. The second thing is that the pensions industry and the investment industry is an expensive industry to get into on your own. But it is possible, if you can generate scale and some mass, that you can also generate some might. And the consequence of that is that you may be able to get products developed and delivered at cheaper prices than might otherwise be the case. And therefore, bringing all of that together in one gives a market cloud that would never exist for the 750,000 of participants any other way. The third is that idea of a custodian role that I mentioned. And I know no other way of doing that other than to establish something or assign that responsibility to something that will operate in the interests of the participants. Now, when we bring all of those things together, we definitively end up in the suggestion that a state entity is required to do all of that. It gives us a couple of other advantages if you make that leap. The first is that we can now start to engage in a whole level of automation that may not be possible in any other way. Because it's a state entity, it can do similarly to revenue and engage with every payroll there is throughout the country, which in turn allows it to automate most of the processing of auto-enrollment and digitize it to the point that nobody has to sit down and fill in a form to register to participate. No employer has to provide any advice, etc., etc. And the last thing is, we could try and leverage some of the existing organisations that exist within the public service to do this, like revenue, because they're great at collecting stuff, or the NTMA, because it's great at investing in stuff. But no matter which organisation we pick, it really doesn't matter which one you pick, they are going to have to do exactly the same thing. They're going to have to develop a whole load of systems, a whole load of processes, a whole load of legislation, and a whole load of organizational structure to do this, because no one is doing all of this right now. And so even if you were to pick revenue to do the collection and the NTMA to do the investment, you'd still need something tying it all together, managing the accounts. Because trust me, I've had the conversations, revenue don't want to do that, and neither does the NTMA. And so no matter which way you go about this, you will end up with something in the centre to fulfil all of those functions. Hence our rationale for state-run CPA. Another thing that has got a lot of traction in conversation are the thresholds that we're employing. 20,000 annual income floor and a floor of 23 years of age. Trust me again when I tell you that I prefer they didn't exist. It would make my life an awful lot easier. It's a lot easier to build and implement a system that doesn't have such constraints in it as to build one that does. And so the reason these exist is because of policy pieces. And the policies are based on a number of facts. The first is, what I should probably say first is the 20,000 per annum is effectively an indicative threshold. We do not intend to wait an entire year after somebody starts a job to decide whether they will be auto-enrolled or not. We will use much shorter reference periods. A classic example would be a quarter. Because we want to get people into the system as early and as quickly as we possibly can so that they are saving for their retirement. The first reason for the 20,000 is based on a determination of adequacy in retirement. And all of you who've worked with pensions over the years will know that that's one of the big measures. And so a replacement rate of 50% has been the classic in Ireland for many, many decades now. We don't think that's anywhere near enough. But when you look at what the state pension gives you, it gives somebody on 20,000 a replacement rate of 69% in gross terms. When you net it out, after somebody on 20,000 has paid tax, USC and all of that, when you net it out, the state pension gives that person a net replacement rate of 73%. So somebody who is going to get effectively 3/4 of their income when they retire being asked to contribute more into pensions just doesn't make any kind of sense. The second thing is that somebody who's on that kind of income is more than likely going to also qualify, at least to some extent, for some of the supplementary payments that the state provides through my department. Like HHB, like fuel allowance, etc., etc. And when you take that into consideration, that same person actually ends up with a replacement rate net of about 88%. So it really doesn't make any sense to go enrolling people in that bracket, in an auto-enrollment system to enhance the pension even further. The second thing, and this is almost the opposite of that, is the organisations that represent people in those income brackets or deal with them regularly, such as MAB, Social Justice Ireland, and those types of organisations, have highlighted grave concerns about the affordability of something like auto-enrollment for people in those income brackets. And I think it behoves us to take that seriously. Because we have seen evidence in other countries, from the examinations we've done of where people inadvertently make bad choices. So there is evidence emerging from the UK through our colleagues in DWP over there that people don't realise they can opt out of AE. They're short of money, but they think they have to stay in it. They don't even realise to some extent that they're in it and have this choice. And as a consequence, they borrow. But they borrow badly. They either run up credit card debt, which is one of the highest regulated borrowing mechanisms there is, or they actually do worse, they engage with money lenders. And this has become a creeping pattern amongst the lowest paid in the UK that they're now quite concerned about and are looking to see how best to address it. I don't want to repeat that mistake here, neither does the Minister or the government, obviously. There is another thing about the 20,000. The 20,000 was originally mooted back in 2018 when we published the straw man consultation. And we haven't changed it at all, but the world has. So that 20,000 that we suggested as a floor back in 2018 is now worth about 17 and a half. And so actually it's got significantly tighter. The next point is that those people under 23 and working, 3/4 of them are actually in full-time education. And so the work they're doing is to pay for that. I have a couple of these creatures in my own house. And so they work weekends so that they have spending power or to pay for a bit of rent. Or increasingly what you find, especially where I live in the hinterland of Dublin, to pay for a car because they can't afford to rent in Dublin. So they drive 30, 40, 50 miles to come to college. And so that's what they are working for, the 3/4 of the people under the age of 23. Now I know some people might think, that's a little bit elitist. And I think that's nonsense. And the reason I think it's nonsense, if the figures were the other way around, I think it would be reasonable to say it was elitist. But 3/4 of the people in full-time education suggest that anything they're earning is for that particular purpose. And as a nation, we have always wanted to encourage that, and I don't think we should disturb it. The second thing is that about 10% of those people are actually our customers. They're customers of the department in one way or another through one of our schemes, and consequently are not engaged really in the workforce. So when you boil it all down, about 7% of people under the age of 23 are working full-time and earning sufficiently to be contributing into pension schemes. And we took the view that we should not, in conscience, enroll all the 400,000 under 23 just to capture 7%. Especially when that 7% can opt in at any time they like, and if they do opt in, they'll be fully rewarded with the employer contribution and the state contribution as well. Another one that keeps coming at us, and I thought worth explaining, is the whole self-employed situation. There are lots of people who have said this shouldn't just be for employees, it should include the self-employed, because they make up a goodly portion of the workforce and a very significant number of them are not in pension schemes. There's a few things about that. The first is that to get this up and running quickly, I said we're establishing a CPA that allows us to do automation through payroll, etc., etc. That model falls apart when you try to include self-employed. Can't use payrolls, can't use automated processes in the same way. Self-employed people, I said this before, tend to be self-determining. They want to decide what to do with their money at any given point in time. And many of them take no wages at all, effectively, and reinvest in their business for many years. And it's only later in life that they then start to take decent income from that business and start to provision for their retirement. And there are special arrangements within the tax code to facilitate them doing that. The second point is that self-employed, even if they really did want to be in an auto-enrollment system, the variability of income usually results in significant variability of contribution. And the consequence of that is that you end up with pots that are either empty or with very low amounts in them for protracted periods of time. And that costs money. And the people who end up paying for that are the low-income PAYE workers who are contributing in all the time because the charges are coming from their funds. And I don't think that's appropriate. And I also don't think it's appropriate when you consider that there's already a ready-made market that the self-employed can engage with out there. There are loads of different pension products they can engage with that are generously supported by tax relief right now. And unlike that PAYE cohort, I think the self-employed cohort are far better positioned to engage with those financial products and financial services because they have to, in some sense, anyway, to run their businesses. Last thing on this, no other country is doing it in their auto-enrollment system, with the exception of Chile. And Chile failed. And the reason Chile failed is for all the reasons I just mentioned. Very low pots being paid for by workers, and it resulted in resentment of that, so they stopped doing it. The last thing I'll say is, we've said in the design document that we're not leaving it at that. We will, once the system is bedded in and working properly for 750,000 people, come back to this and see can we do something specific about it. It's just not obvious what that might be. A couple of last things before I finish up for you. The first is that people have commented on the tax relief versus the state top-up, and I thought it was worth explaining why we do that. This is the only pension system in the state that is compelling people by law to participate in it. So essentially the government is saying, you know, this money that you earned last week, you can't have that anymore, you must put it into this scheme over here. That doesn't happen in any other pension scheme, only in this one. And the consequence of that is that the government is incredibly keen to ensure that every single penny that is taken and put into this scheme is incentivized in exactly the same way, that there is equality of treatment. The tax relief system, good and all as it is, does not do that. You have to do something different. And so that's where the state top-up idea has come from. You could combine it with tax relief in some way or other, but it becomes incredibly complicated to administer and implement, and it becomes virtually impossible to explain it in any kind of simple way that ordinary people would understand it. And we've tried. We have looked at loads of models to see could we do that instead. There is a second thing about this, and that is tax relief is hidden. Most people don't get it. They do get it, but they don't understand it. And so a state top-up is a much more overt way of showing that you're not in this alone. So when somebody looks at their account, it will show them that they've contributed, that their employer has contributed, and that the state has contributed. And so it's much more obvious that people are being helped to save for their retirement. And I think that's important. The two big problems, of course, are the bogeymen that's always thrown out. This will result in arbitrage, and this will result in people not being able to move their pots. Well, the 750,000 people who have no supplementary pension right now, I don't think are lying awake at night worrying about arbitrage. I just don't believe they are. And I also don't believe that they're necessarily worried about porting their pots. I think they are issues that we can solve as we go along. And I do think they're solvable, by the way. I already have ideas for how that might be done. It's just it's not possible for us to solve them in the time that's available to get this system implemented by next year. But we will be looking at it once we bed this system in. And we've committed to doing that in the design principles document that was published. We have deliberately, at this juncture, not included a drawdown process in the design, and that has been commented on as well. But we haven't because we don't believe it's necessary today. The first people that will be drawing from this system will not be drawing from it until 2030, unless something catastrophic happens in their life between when they're enrolled and when they step out. Or they've self-selected to participate and are going after a couple of years. So the vast majority won't have any reason to engage in any kind of drawdown for at least another 6-7 years. That gives us time to tease out drawdown approaches, because we don't believe that the current arrangements in the market are necessarily the most suitable for the cohort of customers that are going to be in auto-enrolment. We don't think this choice between annuity and ARF is necessarily going to cut it. We think that hybrid approaches are most likely required to deal with the plethora of requirements that this cohort will need. And we want to encourage the market to develop such hybrids based on research, and therefore that takes a little bit of time. So for instance, in Australia, one of the big things at the moment is investment-linked annuities, which is worth looking at. And I know some of the institutions in this town are looking very carefully at that as an approach. But that, in combination with other things, are likely to result in a whole new innovative set of products and services that I think are likely to be more appropriate to the AE cohort of customers. And so we're looking forward to the market engaging in that research, that discussion, that consideration over the next couple of years. And when that starts to happen, then we start planning what the drawdown phases from auto-enrollment should look like. Because I'm in agreement with a lot of commentators that in as much as we possibly can, we should facilitate drawdown through auto-enrollment. In the same way, we want people to sleepwalk their way into having a retirement pot in the first place. Ideally, they should be able to sleepwalk their way all the way through their retirement and be well catered for financially through this system. So that's the ultimate aim.
And we're a little bit tight on the time, maybe.
Okay, I'll finish up. So where are we? Legislation's being drafted. My team are in daily contact with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, teasing through all the provisions. They're complicated, but it's going apace. And the intention is that the Minister would be able to bring it to the floor of the House before the summer recess. Many of you were involved in the pre-legislative scrutiny that the Joint Oireachtas Committee conducted late last year and earlier this year, and I'm looking forward to getting the report and seeing how best to deal with whatever recommendations it has for us. We are currently doing a major process analysis and development of procurement exercises for the administrative solutions that are going to be required. And those eagle-eyed among you will have noticed we published a prior information notice last week, and we will be hitting the market with the relevant procurement documents probably within 2 months, if not sooner. And so that is going apace as well. We are working extensively with revenue and payroll software developers to ensure that the appropriate interfaces and data flows can occur when they're needed. So that work is underway. And we are working with the Pensions Authority to work out the very best supervisory model for this system. Because it's not an IR and it's not a master trust, but it's got bits of both. And so we want to make sure that 1, we're not reinventing wheels, but 2, that we're not putting inappropriate regulation in place. So that work is underway as well. So to finish, there is no way of designing something like this perfectly. There will always be something that will cause somebody some difficulty somewhere. But what the government has sought to do across all the various demands is strike a reasonable balance between the earliest possible implementation of a fair and adequate system that's suitable for the vast majority of the customer base it's going to have, on the one hand, and then a whole load of flexibilities and options that we might be able to provide over time, on the other hand. We're definitively in implementation mode. As far as we're concerned, the design work has been done, but that doesn't mean that we're not willing to listen to really good suggestions that might help either to speed it up or improve the implementation in the timeline that's available to us. And the Minister has already said that 2024 is a definite, and as far as we're in the department are concerned, it absolutely is. It's ambitious, but we will make it.
Good. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do is, but I suppose you should clap first. That's enough. So what we're going to do is move quite quickly through, and then we we should have a good bit of time for questions at the end when you've heard the whole package. Our next speaker is a person who's been working on pensions for a lot of her working life. Rosheen Callender is a former economist with ICTU and the Transport General Workers Union. Also a former advisor to the Minister for Social Welfare at the time, a former member of the Pensions Board, and in all of those jobs she has been totally committed to pension reform. So a good person to talk now. Rosheen. John, can you find over? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. I'd like to start by congratulating the present government and Minister Helen Humphreys in particular for publishing this draft legislation, and in particular the civil servants like Tim Duggan who've worked so hard to bring it to this point. And I was very, very interested in his explanation of where we stand now. I hope very much also that they'll be willing and able to take on board the various suggestions that are now being made to make this long-delayed provision of auto-enrolment into the best possible arrangement of its kind. I think it's important to stress the economic and social principles and objectives underlying this auto-enrolment scheme. Basically, as Tim has said, its purpose is to fill a very large gap in our current pensions coverage, thus addressing very major income and gender inequalities for future retirees. By doing so, I think it can and it should bring major financial, economic and social benefits to what's currently a very unequal society, especially in the upper age groups. You don't need me to quote the statistics. You know, as Tim has said, most lower paid workers are still women, that most workers without supplementary pensions to top up the state pension are still lower paid women, and since women still live a bit longer than men, most of the people living in poverty in their older years are women and men without supplementary pensions, unless supported by another member of their household or other forms of savings. I remember for many years when talking about equality and the gender pay gap, going on and on about the need for us to talk about not only the gender pay gap, but the gap with two P's, gender and pay and pensions. And I think there's still a need for that discussion. Many years of work have gone in by trade unions and others, and our state pensions are still too low really to provide adequate incomes in retirement for most people unless they're well supplemented. The full contributory state pension, as Tim has said, is still only about a third of average industrial earnings, nowhere near the 50% to which the unions have aspired. It still needs to be improved in my view, it needs very much to be backed up by a new National Pension Reserve Fund, but that's another story, another day's work. Meanwhile, we have to take the opportunity of making the new proposed auto-enrolment scheme work very well to fill that big gap, because again, in the private sector, only 1 in 3 workers are in an occupational or private pension scheme to supplement the state pension. So the new scheme is crucially important to reduce income and gender inequalities for future pensioners. At present, Ireland's the only OECD country without a mandatory pay-related pillar to fill that gap between the first pillar, the state pension, and the second pillar, the supplementary pensions that support so few of our population at the moment. And now we have this great chance again to make sure the new pillar is a good, strong one that supports all who need it. I was fortunate to be on a working group in 2006 that produced a very large report that's sitting there beside John, and it was very quickly after its birth. It was buried hastily in the middle of a holiday period in August of 2006. A common tactic, but I think we need to now make sure the new scheme is as good as it can possibly be. If we're the last to implement it in the OECD, let's try and make it the best. So before suggesting some changes that I think would improve the current proposals and increase the chances of effectively addressing those income and gender inequalities, I just wanted to make a couple of general points about the way we talk about pensions, the way we weigh up their costs and don't weigh up their benefits. Very often we hear a lot about the big costs associated with the ageing population, and that pension's a time bomb that awaits us down the road. And I, for one, would like to say ban that bomb and any talk about it, because it's not a bomb. And welcome ageing, because we can make it better now through auto-enrollment for a lot more people than before. So generally what we hear all the time is the gross cost of future state pensions. We rarely see attempts to measure the net cost after all the financial, economic and social benefits are taken into account. Some should be easier to mention, like the additional tax revenues that to the exchequer, if a higher proportion of retirees have good pensions. Obviously there's more tax and other income coming in, both direct and indirect tax revenues. I think other costs and benefits that are harder to mention, like the health benefits and savings if more pensioners are on higher incomes, but we do all know that that would be the case, and we don't often try or hear about even to measure the economic and social benefits of more people in the upper age groups being healthier, being able to do paid and often unpaid work, perhaps a different sort of work than they did before, maybe part-time work or perhaps some voluntary work in their community. And that also brings society very great benefits, which we rarely try to measure. In relation to voluntary work, for example, I'm reminded of great work done by a friend of mine during COVID, going all around her town delivering food and other provisions to people who weren't willing or unable to go shopping themselves at that time. She couldn't have done that without the support of her good teacher's pension and her car. And I know that there were a lot more like her, not just during COVID, but all the time, social work that is unmeasured because it's voluntary. I myself have found increasingly angry about the nasty terminology around pension costs, the failure to measure the benefits of good pensions. Even from some journalists who should know better, talking about old folk being such a burden on young struggling taxpayers and so on. And myself, having worked for 40 years, mostly full-time, paid tax, both direct and indirect and so on, really resent being called a burden at this stage, and I think we need to put an end to that kind of terminology. We've just got a lot of work to do to make sure that future pensioners are more like me, with a good pension and paying lots of tax even in retirement. So how can we use this valuable tool more effectively? How can we use it really to reduce income and gender inequality in the future? And how can we measure the benefits of that in people's minds, I think, if not on their pieces of paper? First of all, looking again at the proposed age and income thresholds, I do believe, despite the very convincing arguments Tim has made about the existing age and income thresholds, I do think that the current proposal to wait until 23 to enrol people and to not allow them to enrol after the age of 60, I do think that should be a lot more flexible, and that the 20,000 earnings threshold should be done away with, actually. I think it's far too restrictive. A lot of people are working well before the age of 23, and even if they're not earning huge amounts, I think it would be important to get them into the new auto-enrolment scheme. PRSI starts to be paid from the age of 16, so I think it makes sense to start auto-enrolment contributions at the same time, as the Congress of Trade Unions has strongly argued. Why waste those first 7 years when there are people in that age group who could be enrolled, even if it's not always that easy. About excluding the self-employed, I feel that self-employed people, many of them are often the people with the poorest pension provision, and I'd see that there must be ways of including them, because increasingly there is great movement between employees and self-employed, more and more, I think, and probably will increase in the future. So if you're enrolled in a pension scheme and you are self-employed for a while or even unemployed, I think it's most important that you're able to continue with your pension contributions. I also see no good reason to stop people from starting to contribute if they're over 60, because in future there are probably going to be more and more people working well beyond that age, whether they're employed or self-employed, and people who have reason to supplement whatever they have or haven't built up by then by way of pension. Some may have had gaps in their employment, or they may have worked where there was no occupational scheme. So why make them waste those 6 years when they could be contributing towards increasing their state pension a bit? But I'd suggest that instead of phasing in their contributions, they obviously wouldn't have time to do that they just pay the 6% or 5% from the start. Otherwise they wouldn't have time to build up anything worthwhile. I agree very strongly with the Congress of Trade Unions recommendations. There shouldn't be a lower income threshold for starting the contributions. I think that would further exclude too many younger and lower paid workers, although Tim has given us some figures that we need to think about, that there are actually very few in that category who are earning anything worthwhile to be making contributions. But I still think it would be worth making the system much more flexible so that those younger people can join as soon as they possibly can. I think there shouldn't be that lower income threshold for starting contributions. I think that further excludes younger and lower paid workers, especially women. And women most need to start their contributions early, as they're most likely to have gaps in their pensionable employment later on. So as Congress says, an income threshold, wherever it's set, could also act as a disincentive for some employers to increase people's wages at that point, or to promote them to better paid positions. I should probably, maybe at the risk of going over my time, Kevin, sorry.
I'll do a quick cough now, and you've got 3 minutes.
I should confess that, in case some of you remember, that for many years I actually argued for pension contributions to start at birth, first child benefit payment, and it was SIP2 policy for a number of years. We envisaged a state-run scheme that would start at birth, and I still have occasional fantasies about that. I still have fantasies about every baby being given an acorn or a baby oak tree growing first in the pensions pot, and to be watched as it grows into a sturdy old oak tree, symbolising the steady growth of their retirement income and also contributing to the much needed growth in Ireland's forestry. But I suppose I have to be realistic at this stage, and I fully do support the Congress proposal for starting at 16, even if in the back of my own mind it means wasting those first 16 years. I think Congress is right on the age 16, that's when you start PRSI, and absolutely right to argue for the abolition of any income threshold, and to insist that sole traders and self-employed people with no employees should be enrolled in the new scheme. I think that will um, reduce any incentive for employers to misclassify certain workers as self-employed, as was the case with some I remember very well, trying hard to avoid paying employers PRSI. I also think that the Congress suggestion about the ratio of employer to employee contributions should more closely mirror those in occupational schemes, so that if the employer contribution should be slightly higher, the ratio then, instead of being 6-6-2 as between employers, employees and the state, the ratio should be 7-5-2, so that employees are paying 5%. Should be more common. On the tax side, just if I can have a few minutes on this, I do think that we have to try and stay with the existing system of giving tax relief at one's marginal rate. I don't agree at all that workers don't understand the benefits of that. I remember very clearly when trying to persuade workers to join pension schemes that the tax relief was the big incentive and was very clearly understood, particularly by people who, because the low threshold for the higher rate of tax, people who'd be getting the relief at 40%, and then when the lower pension is finally paid, they'll be only paying tax at 20%. It was a big incentive and it was very clearly understood. I disagree totally with the words in the draft legislation that imply that people don't understand tax relief. Not my experience at all. So I would argue that the contributions should be in those proportions, that employees as well as employers get tax relief on their contributions, and that the state then puts in the lump sum as suggested. So I also have major doubts about following the UK approach to managing the monies from the auto-enrolment in the way suggested, and I'm very attracted to the alternative approach that you're going to hear about from Colm Fagan. But I would just make a couple of points about the investment policy and oversight. First, I think there must be an obligation on the investment managers, whoever they are, to adhere to very strict guidelines on ESG, that's environmental, social and governance issues, and to ensure that investments are made in sustainable and eco-friendly industries that help us to achieve the agreed climate change goals. I also think I'm finishing now.
Thanks, Niamh.
I won't sum up. I also think the oversight body needs to have appropriate representation by trade unions and other bodies committed to ESG principles. And finally, I think the idea put forward by another actuary, Jim Kehoe, who's suggesting that people might have the right to use their accumulated auto-enrolment funds to actually augment their state pension. I think that's an idea that's also worthy of further consideration. So I'm not going to try and sum up. I'll hand over to Colm.
Thanks, Steve. It's very unfair when someone has worked on something for 20 or 30 or 40 years to ask them to speak for only 10 minutes, but Rosheen, you did very well, I think, in the context. Colm Fagan is an actuary, a former president of the Society of Actuaries in Ireland, an advisor to many of the insurance and pension companies over the years. He's also been, I suppose, the biggest critic, not of the auto-enrolment proposal, but of some of the issues of how it is to be implemented. And maybe now is your chance, within the time allocated, if you can, your 20 minutes.
Thanks very much,
to deal with that. Thanks, Niamh, Colm.
Firstly, I'd like to thank TASC for inviting me to present today. I also want to thank Rosheen Callender for suggesting that they invite me. Above all, though, I want to thank Brian Woods for his constant support, personal and technical, over the 4.5 years or so that I've been trying to get traction for the ideas that I'm about to present to you. Finally, of course, I wanted to thank you all for attending, and really I'm delighted at the attendance today. The other day at breakfast, I mentioned to my wife that I was thinking of building my presentation around the catchphrase, out with the old, in with the new. There was silence for a second. She said, Colm, do you really think that's a good idea? I said, why? Well, you know, as I'm calling for out with the old at your age. But anyway, I'm here. I find it surprising that auto-enrolment schemes generally are modelled on private sector defined contribution schemes. They don't recognise the special features of auto-enrolment. They assume that each individual's pension pot is hermetically sealed and that everyone acts in their own self-interest. The obsession with ensuring that everyone gets exactly their pound of flesh, no more, no less, makes schemes complicated and adds to costs at members' expense. This can be seen most clearly at retirement, when members must leave and fend for themselves. They have to buy an individual product, which normally has fat margins to ensure good rewards for manufacturers and distributors. The scheme, as proposed, will be costly to introduce and difficult to administer. There isn't a snowball's chance in hell of meeting the 2024 target implementation date. Furthermore, the long-term cost of administering it will be close to double the proposed 0.5% charge. And Brian and I have done some calculations to work that out. My proposal starts from the premise that auto-enrolment is a form of national wealth fund and that it will grow indefinitely. There will be no need to sell assets for 50 years at least. All contributions, irrespective of age of individual members, will be invested to earn high sustainable returns over the very long term. Therefore, investments will be chosen with an eye to improving the health of the planet and of society in general. I'm also proposing that members remain in the scheme for life. They add to their pension account while they're working, then they draw gradually from it in retirement. Investments will be passed from one generation to the next at values that are fair to both parties. Equity-type investments deliver higher returns than bonds in the longer term. I'm assuming that the extra return will be around 4% on average. On that assumption, the smoothed approach delivers more than 50% better value to members. That can be translated into higher benefits or lower contributions. The required contribution for what the DSP calls an adequate pension falls by 35%, from 14% to 9.1%, split between employers, workers and state, as per the slide. Very importantly, the smooth scheme can be implemented quickly and cheaply, and the long-term cost of running it will be considerably less than the proposed 0.5% charge. To paraphrase my fellow countyman, Enda Kelly, the approach I'm proposing will make Ireland the best little country in the world for pensions. Under the scheme proposed in the bill, decisions on asset purchases and sales will be made at individual member level. Members can decide their own risk level, low risk, low return, or high risk, hoping for high returns, but at high risk. This raises the question, how will workers decide what risk level is right for them? Will the government offer free advice? If not, who will advise? And more importantly, who will pay for that advice? Good advice does not come cheap. The vast majority of workers will choose the default option. They're defaulted into a high-risk fund, mainly equities when young, then gradually moved towards lower-risk investments as they get older. The problem is that they are transferred into investments that are guaranteed to give the lowest returns just when their pension accounts are the most valuable. The investment return in just 1 year at an older age could exceed the total return in the first 10 years of a new contributor. Finally, the proposed scheme is complicated. There won't be just one default fund. Nest, the main automatic enrolment vehicle in the UK, has 46 of them. Two people could be working side by side, both choosing the default option, but getting different investment returns, simply because they're different ages. The smooth approach looks at the scheme as a whole. Positive cash flows are assured for decades to come, and investments are chosen accordingly. Everyone gets exactly the same return. In particular, there is no reduction at older ages. Also, assets don't have to be sold. They're transferred between generations at values that are fair to both parties. Under the scheme proposed in the draft bill, everyone genuflects to the god of market values. So each of the 40 or so unit-linked funds that will have to be valued, so each of the 40 or so unit-linked funds will have to be valued daily. That means 10,000 valuations a year, with units added or taken from members' accounts at each valuation date. That's a lot of operational risk. Market values are subject to wild swings. The gyrations in the first 6 months of 2020, which is at the start of COVID, are shown here in yellow. They were unusual, but not unprecedented. The fall in March 2020 was 15.1%. It was over 20% earlier in the month. Sharp market falls can cause investors to lose faith. Loss of faith is more likely when they have little experience of stock markets, which is almost always the case for members of an AE scheme. Workers are more likely to stop contributing when they see the value of their pension accounts falling sharply. Who could blame them? Last year, I was honoured to get joint first place in a competition sponsored by the UK Institute and Faculty of Actuaries for my smoothed equity approach to auto-enrolment. Smoothing transforms the AE account from an investment to a high-interest savings account. The two lines marked in yellow on this graph show the transformation. The first is a repeat of the market returns on the previous slide. The figures are scary. The second shows smooth returns for the same 6 months. They are so smooth that they can be calculated quarterly rather than monthly, and most importantly, they are all positive. This slide shows smoothed and market values for the 30 years from 1990 to 2020. Smooth returns, the blue line, are positive every month for the entire period, while market returns, the orange line, fall about 1 month in every 3. On 10 occasions over the 30-year period, market values fell by more than 8% in a month. A strange feature of the scheme proposed in the bill is that it specifically prohibits payment of pensions to retired members. Instead, they must leave and buy an individual product from a private sector provider. As noted earlier, this is good news for the purveyors of such products, not such good news for workers. After stating in Head 58 that the scheme won't pay a pension, Head 59 says that a drawdown facility may be added in future. It's like designing a car without brakes, but promising to add them when the car is on the road. It just can't be done. The DSP has suggested that innovation will save the day, that by the time retiring workers' accounts are large enough to be converted into pensions, financial institutions will have come up with wonderful new ideas. I hate to disabuse them, but innovation in financial services often takes the form of finding new ways to part savers from their money. This slide shows the type of innovation that savers could do without. The offer seems very attractive. At the time, that was the 1st of January last year, interest rates were almost zero. The investor's capital was 100% secure unless a particular share index fell by more than 50% over the following 10 years. But the problem wasn't the definition of the share index. The reality, however, is that there's a 1 in 6 chance of losing more than half your investment and a 5 in 6 chance of getting your capital back in full. There's no in between. It's either money back with interest or lose more than half of it. On average, losing more than 60% of your investment. Do you think many savers would choose this particular product if it were explained in those stark terms rather than in the terms of the ad? Brian Woods and I spent much of the last 15 months or so trying to stop advertising typified by this ad, without much success, unfortunately. You can see why we call it Russian roulette. A 1 in 6 chance of blowing your financial brains out. A 5 in 6 chance of getting your money back with interest. Is that the type of innovative product that workers will be offered when pension pots mature? No, innovation by the private sector won't save the day. In any event, there's a fundamental problem with the proposed scheme. Retiring members will always need advice. Ordinary workers just don't have enough knowledge of financial services to decide which of the many products on offer is right for them. Good advice does not come cheap. Also, the cost of advising someone with a pot worth 100 grand is much the same as the cost of advising someone with a pot worth $1 million. But the drag on returns is much greater for the smaller pot. No amount of innovation will solve that problem. Finally, even though you say, oh, this is a problem for the future, the 14% required contribution rate, which is being told now, that makes assumptions now on what will happen in the future. It assumes, and we've done the figures, the calculation, it assumes that savings of retired workers, once they've retired, will earn just 0.5% a year, net of charges. This implies a negative real return, because I think it assumes inflation of 1% a year. This implies a negative real return all through retirement, which could last for 30 years or more. That's reality. It's completely different with smoothed approach. The member's pension looks like a high-interest deposit account. The only change between pre- and post-retirement is the account is added to during working years and drawn down in retirement, earning interest all the time. The transition is absolutely seamless. There's no need for pension consultants, investment advisors, asset allocators, or anyone else of that ilk. The member can start drawing down from the account whenever they stop working. They can also vary the withdrawal amount. For example, take less if they're working part-time, more if they have a son or daughter still in college. I'm proposing a minimum drawdown of 3% a year, a maximum of 8% a year to age 80, with more than 8% above that age. I devise what I think is a neat solution to the risk of outliving one's savings. On reaching 75, retired members can, but are not obliged to, convert their pension account into 15 equal sub-accounts. I'll be coming up soon to that option date. And they can convert them into 15 sub-accounts and take one every year for the next 15 years until they're age 90. On death, any unclaimed accounts are paid to the estate. If the member lives beyond age 90, they'll have taken all the 15 sub-accounts, but they still continue to receive a sub-account each year for the rest of their lives. The bonus sub-accounts from age 90 will be funded by a lower interest rate from age 75. Now, Brian told me not to do that because it's my little baby and I'm very proud of the inventions that were on top of the other thing. The proposed maximum annual charge for the proposed scheme is 0.5% of members' accounts. However, it hasn't been written explicitly into the draft bill, so maybe there's still some question mark about that. It would be impossible to run the scheme as proposed at anything close to that figure. The required break-even charge will be closer to 1%, that's after we doing our sums on it. A simple comparison with Nest makes this clear. That's Nest in the UK. Nest charges approximately 0.5% a year, made up slightly differently. Yet it had a cumulative deficit of £800 million at the 31st of March last. Well over a decade after its establishment. It won't clear the deficit until 2038. Nest enjoys economies of scale that we won't have. It boasts over 11 million members. We'd have around 750,000. Yet the costs of establishing the scheme in Ireland won't be much less than they were in the UK, considering especially some of the fiendishly complicated provisions that are in the scheme in relation to opt-out at the start and every time contributions increase. On the other hand, the smooth approach, sorry, I forgot to get, Donal, you forgot to remind me about my water. Sorry.
Thanks. Would you go around 5 minutes?
Yeah, it costs much less than 0.5% to administer in the long term. Revenues will be higher and costs lower. Revenues will be higher because members will stay in the scheme post-retirement instead of being kicked out, as with the scheme proposed in the draft heads of bill. As I said, the margins in a single year for a newly retired member should exceed total margins in the first 10 years for a young worker. That explains, by the way, why the private sector is so keen to get its hands on retirees' money. The costs will be lower because there are fewer moving parts. The fund will only need to be valued 4 times a year, compared with 10,000 valuations a year required for the proposed scheme. The complications of unit linking, lifestyling, etc. will also be avoided completely. Members' accounts will look just like high-interest savings accounts. The end result is speedier implementation, less operational risk, lower costs, and of course, much higher benefits. Because the smooth approach is novel, government will have to be sure that it works before giving it the green light. They'll have to appoint independent experts to assess it. The required competencies and a likely programme of work are set out on this slide. Brian Woods and I will be more than happy to help in any way we can on a pro bono basis, sharing our analyses and spreadsheets with them. As Brian and I, we joked on the way in this morning, other people play golf for pastimes in retirement, we do something different, we're doing this. The cost savings when the scheme is mature are estimated at €200 million a year. And that's not counting the enormous benefits to employers and workers and to society at large. It really will be the best auto-enrolment scheme in the world by far. Finally, despite the change of direction, the smooth scheme will still be in place sooner than the scheme proposed in the draft bill. That's because the numbers simply won't add up for what's proposed. Furthermore, the complications are such that third-party administrators won't want to touch it. A government's decision to opt for the smooth scheme is the best way to ensure early implementation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Colm. So here's how I think we should proceed, because it's clear to me that we have a good developing debate, if not row, and I think it's an important one. But it's also clear to me that we've said to people that they can leave at 1. So how do we square that? I think, if you don't mind, we'll ask our respondents to come and do their 5 minutes each, and then we will have a general discussion. And it might go on beyond 1, but at 1 o'clock we will stop, give anyone who wants to leave a chance to leave, with hopefully the best part of the debate behind them. But if people want to stay for a few minutes afterwards and the colleagues don't mind, we can continue the debate a little bit. So, if you don't mind, so the next person to speak, respond to all you've heard is Donal de Butléir. Donal has been on about 125 public groups over the years, having a distinguished career in the Revenue Commissioners and in the AIB Bank. He has done so much pro bono work that only John Fitzgerald will be able to say he's done as much. So, Donal, please fire away.
Thanks, Chairman. If you live a long time, you get to do a lot of things. First of all, should I say I greatly welcome the proposal for auto-enrolment. I think it's a big advance. I wrote a paper in 2011 for the Kinmare Conference with John Thornhill, actually proposing that, endorsing that scheme. We were inspired by the Central Provident Fund in New Zealand, or in Singapore. And I want to thank Colm for putting on the table what I think is a very credible option, an attractive option. Why do I say it's credible? Well, he's gotten a recognition from a panel chaired by John Kay. Now, I met John Kay 40 years ago, and if John Kay says there's something in something, I'm convinced that there is. So I would strongly endorse the proposal that it be independently assessed and validated. It's a big prize we're looking at here, because under the smoothing scheme, the costs would be very significantly lower to provide the same level of pensions. And why is that? Why is that important? Well, I think if we just look at the context that this scheme is going to be implemented in, and I hope it is implemented in it, is that if you read the Pensions Commission report, the Commission on Tax and Welfare, just looking at the overall demographic situation, taxes in this country in 10 years' time are going to be significantly higher than they are now. And our yield from corporation tax is likely to be significantly lower. That's going to have to be transferred to other areas of tax. And I think there's a general, and in my view, welcome demand for a bigger state. I think the state is going to have to give more. So the sort of tax levels that we're looking at the moment will be totally inadequate to fund, I think, what are going to be the needs going forward. Now, just looking at the system, looking at again at the Commission on Taxation, PRSI is going to be higher. Auto-enrolment will add 6% for employees, 6% of employers to the wedge between what the cost to the employer and what the employee gets in. And this could have very significant labour market effects. And I think that one of the implications of this is that there may have to be a big shift, a significant shift, from direct taxes to other forms of taxation. And that's something I think that hasn't been factored into this debate at all. We're very good in this country at tackling individual problems, but synthesising them and putting them together, I think, is something that we need to get better at. The other thing, just coming to the end, I think costs are very important. A few years ago, 2% difference in costs takes out 48% of your fund. Now, when I read the Turner Commission report all those years ago, they were looking at costs of achievable, because scale is important, at 0.3%. Like 0.5 is high and significantly higher. The final thing I want to say is that, having been through the transition myself at retirement, is the idea that sort of relatively unsophisticated people, because that's mainly who's going to be in the auto-enrolment scheme, is entrusting them to the tender mercies of the pensions industry is something that I would have grave reservations about. Thank you very much.
Laura, thanks. Laura Bambrick is a economist with ICTU, has done us all the service of having always had an economic unit that provides a different perspective. And you have when most of the economists in the country are employed either by the public sector or by the private sector, it's good to have a third sector that is not maybe quite so tied to agendas, or at least has a different perspective.
Thanks for those kind words, Kevin. So as mentioned, my name is Laura and I'm with the Irish Congress of Trade Union, and Rosheen has very well set out what our situation, what our position is, so I'll try not to repeat myself. Just to say that we very much welcome this. Irish Congress of Trade Union have long been calling for concrete action to address our alarming low levels of second-tier pension coverage, as Tim mentioned there, in and around the 30s. And if we look at the very recent activity report from the Pension Authority, they show that the number of workers covered by a private company pension in 2022 has actually fallen. And this is alarming because this is at a time when the workforce is growing and has never been so big. Now we are seeing an uptake in the number of workers covered by public sector pensions and private retirement saving products. But it does show that our voluntary approach to retirement savings just isn't working, and that's what this bill will do, and ICTU will be working with Tim and his team to help him deliver on his ambition to get this over the line by 2024, because we cannot go to the polls without this being legislated for. So Tim has already preempted many of my concerns, having heard them on more than one occasion, around the lower income threshold, the lower age threshold. But a third main concern for ICTU and our affiliated unions that haven't been mentioned here today and hasn't been mentioned in the public discussion around this is the risks that AE poses to diluting and displacing good company pensions. And in short, that can happen because at 6%, that's the contribution the employer is going to make on auto-enrolment. That's lower than many of our good collectively bargained pensions. So government are flagging to employers to say 6% is a reasonable contribution. A second area of risk is that in a company pension, you more often than not do not join until you have passed your probationary period, and that can be no longer than 6 months. So the risk is that on day one when you join, you will be, as your employer is mandated to do, enrolled in the auto-enrolment scheme. There is no safeguarding that those new employees over time, after their 6 months, won't then go into the better, more generous company policy. So over time, we will see that good company policy as more people retire. The new employees auto-enrollment now becomes the good company policy. So we are looking at ways that we can address that blockage to day one entry into the company pensions, but that is a piece of work that will have to be addressed. So just a few things, like as I said, Rosheen really set out ICTU's concerns and disputes around having the 20,000 and having at 23 the thresholds. At 23, as Rosheen said, regardless of whether a worker is working to get the car to drive them to UCD or whether they have left school and are a full-time employee, we still expect them to pay 4% of their PRSI. For most workers, their state pension is going to be their main draw on the social insurance fund. So we're already asking a 16-year-old to pay. And the workers who are entering our workforce at 16, 17, 18, 19, not getting that car out to UCD, they are the people that are in the type of professions that will not be able to contribute to their AE scheme at 60, 61, 62 and up to 70 or 66 as the upper age limit will be under this legislation. So we are losing the opportunity for those young workers to save for a retirement when they are having that longer working life, but it's starting earlier than the vast majority that will go into third level. Just around the 20,000, it is a good point that currently the state pension provides good replacement rates for those who are earning at or below the full-time minimum wage. A couple of points on that. We do not have any protections around the rate of the state pension. It is the gift of politicians to decide at pension time whether they're going to put 5 or 10 or 12 euros onto the pension. We don't have an income lock on it. We don't have benchmarking. We don't have index linking. We are also in January of next year moving to a total contributions approach. I presume, given the nature of this, the audience know what I'm talking about by total contribution, but in sum, that is going to make it more difficult for workers to qualify for the full pension. Already 1 in 6 workers don't qualify for the full contribution pension. It's going to be harder in 10 years' time when we have a full total contribution involved. So it's really important, and again, as Rosheen mentioned, it does put in that 20,000 the highest lower income threshold in any AE pension scheme, the same with 23. If we don't put that in place, we are putting in employment disincentives, income cliffs, that if you earn a bit more, get a promotion, change job, all of a sudden your take-home pay drops by 6% because you have moved above that 20,000. And it places an incentive on low pay, low wage, low hours employers not to provide decent jobs, because in doing so, they will add 6% to their labour costs. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Our final panelist is John Fitzgerald. If there was a Diane of Irish economics, it might well be John.
Oh, thank you. Auto-enrollment began when the old age pension was introduced in, was it 1909, that people signed up in droves in Ireland, and Colm Fagan has shown that the average age in Ireland rocketed that year because there were no such things as birth certs, so you just signed up, whereas in England people weren't as wise and argued well out of the pensions. In terms of one of the things which I think is central and which the proposals do recognise is that this is a state responsibility. When the UK Thatcher government tried to allow people to opt out and arrange their pensions privately, after a number of years, when it was realised that people of Britain were being ripped off by the pensions industry that were providing it, the UK government recognised that in the long run they were responsible for people's pensions and the system wasn't going to work. So it was a huge contingent liability for the state, so they accepted it. So the state is responsible, and it is the residual responsibility of the state that anything that goes wrong in the pension scheme, the state will ultimately carry the can on that. So in terms of design, I think that is something that needs to be considered. The issue of cost is really important, and Tim emphasised this, and I thought that Colm also in his proposal, how we minimise the cost, in that, and Donal mentioned it as well, the difference between 0.5% and 1% of the cost is huge in terms of, when you're talking in terms of returns of 2, 3, 4%. So finding a scheme and simplifying it so as to minimise cost, and also doing it at scale, and that's why the state ultimately has to do this. Doing this on a private basis, the costs become prohibitive. In terms of investment policy, I think it's something which people haven't talked about. There was a mention in terms of ESG investment plans. If the state interferes in the investment policy, in terms of managed funds, the benefits are minimal relative to passive funds. Once you decide you're going to interfere, and rather than having a passive investment fund, and you're going to say, oh, we should invest in Ireland or whatever, the returns are likely to fall and the costs rise very significantly. One of my concerns would be geographical diversity of the portfolio. It may sound counterintuitive, but it's in the people's interest that the funds are basically invested outside of Ireland, because the biggest risk to somebody in terms of their pension is something goes wrong with Ireland and the Irish economy, and you're hedged against that risk. So I think giving more thought to the investment strategy will be important, because that will ultimately determine the returns. And if there is a failure in the scheme, the state will end up with a lot of very angry people calling on them to make up the difference. What Colm suggested, I'm not, in terms of the smooth scheme, I don't know enough about it. It is really attractive, And the concern there is there a risk to the state if the state is so anyway, I'll leave that to you. But the thing which I think, the point which I really took from you, Colm, was this idea that you cash out of the scheme at retirement and you've got to look after yourself after that. That makes no sense, because if the whole point of having a state scheme is to minimise the cost for people, where every individual has to make their pension provision individually, the costs are huge, and with long interest rates going to zero or negative and then back up again, depending on when you retire, it will make a huge difference to what your pension is. So I think even if people don't accept, and I am predisposed to accept your suggestion, even if they don't accept that, on the issue and of what happens when you retire, I think that needs further thought. Now, in terms of the legislation, it can go ahead in terms of auto-enrolment, because nobody's going to retire for some time. You can leave in the option of cashing out and taking your lump sum, and then bring in an additional provision where people can leave their money in as Colm suggested. That is not something that has to be determined now. And the final, also the issue on self-employed, Tim, you said that is work in progress. It is complicated. And I think that it's, for the future, finding a way where self-employed people can participate in a state scheme. It may be different, but that isn't ruled out, but it's too early to go ahead with it. The final point, Laura, the point which you made about the income cliff, that if somebody is on low pay and then you get a pay rise and suddenly your pay goes down by 6%, I can see a problem there, that was something that hadn't struck me as being an issue. I was predisposed, I thought Tim made a very convincing case until I heard what you had to say. But I will go away from today with a lot of uncertainty, I'm afraid, on how things could be further improved. But I think the auto-enrolment scheme, getting the scheme up and running, is great. And so, some of the innovations or changes which can be made after the event. Thank you.
Tim worked with me, indeed, lately for me for a while, and he had this look on his face that he would give me when I wasn't quite understanding. And he's been giving me that look the last 10 minutes, so I think he's going to have to need to get a little bit of a time to respond. But maybe I'll collect 3 or 4 questions for the panel and for Tim first, and then we'll have a response from him in particular, and then come back to the group. I saw Jim's hand first, and then this lady whom I don't know.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Tim for his very clear presentation of parliamentary thinking. And it's likely, as Laura says, that automatic auto-enrolment will lead to displacement. That is, that people shut down good current schemes and they'll switch to automatic enrolment scheme. And this is particularly because of the implementation of ORP. ORP will make huge costs for existing pension schemes, and it's very likely that smaller schemes will close. So what is the department's view on policy on this? Can I ask just one other question to Mr. Colm?
Very briefly, yeah.
Why is the equity risk premium positive?
Do you want me to answer it now?
No, just gather.
You also state in your paper that it's always positive. Given that it's technically very difficult to remember, to calculate, and also you say in the long run it's positive. In the long run, we have to remember we're all dead.
Sorry. Would you mind saying who you are, just
yep,
briefly?
Moya Murdoch, Chief Executive of Insurance Ireland. I'm here to try and assure people that they're not all bad, the insurance sector, and there's a lot of very good pension schemes out there, as Laura has mentioned, that people are members of. 2 points I just want to make. We have obviously the experience of the UK, which has their own auto-enrolment scheme going, and Nest spoke recently at a pension summit in Croke Park, and if they could do one thing, they would go back and lower the threshold for income, and that was almost unanimously mentioned here today. And I would just point out that there is a private member's bill going through the British Parliament at the moment by a Conservative MP, calling for just that, and if they could do it again they would lower it, and that's what we think here everybody is calling for, because I think yes, saying starting at 20,000 is, because of hard-pressed people, but what about the women, primarily the lower paid, who are in part-time jobs and are much less paid at the levels of enrolment? And also, I would also argue that the 23-year-old, I think starting young people earlier on saving is far more benefits in the long term. We can see what's happening in France when we try to raise the age to gather more adequacy in the pensions. I think we need to start much earlier and get the same window of contributions. The second point I just want to make briefly is I would not underestimate the cost of trying to set this up. As having been the chief executive of a public body, the cost of trying to get the staff needed, the numbers involved, you're competing with the private sector. There's a serious amount of fiduciary risk in this, both for chief executives and for boards, and I just don't know how that could be done at the 0.5% that we're talking about here. This is a massive undertaking to take for any public body, and you can't underestimate the long-term cost of that, and I think there's a missed opportunity on leveraging the existing framework there of the very well-regulated pension
I don't want to cut you off, but my thank you really for it. So I think it's Brian first, then we go to the gentleman at the back, then Jerry, and then this gentleman over here, and then we'll cut it for that round, and then we come back in for the next round. Brian.
Brendan Burgess from the consumer website askaboutmoney.com, where, by the way, we have a forum that discusses specifically auto-enrollment. We can come back next year or in 5 years' time and we can discuss whether it should be 20 years of age or 23 years of age or 20,000 or whether it should be 6% to 3%. All of these things can be changed, can be designed afterwards. But anybody who's looked at this scheme, anybody who's looked at what Colm has proposed, knows that it works and knows that it's the right way to do things. For some reason, Tim and his department is completely blind to that. And my concern, Tim, is that while you can change the age afterwards, you can't just suddenly in 5 years' time realise this works. Because Colm, am I right in saying that if this isn't there from the start, it's almost impossible to actually do it right, then to implement that? That is my main concern. And Tim, I'd ask you, don't be wasting time in the age and stuff like that. And you're right about self-employed and leave them until later. You really have to do it the way Colm says it, or some version of it.
Yeah, Brendan, thank you. Who was it over here? Yeah, please.
Cardiff.
Sorry, didn't see it till you stood up.
First of all, auto-enrollment is a great idea. But the real question here is not why we should congratulate people on doing it now. It's why wasn't it done 20 years ago? It's a simple thing, despite what you said earlier, fairly simple thing to do, and it's been done elsewhere. So that's just made lost time. Secondly, point I want to make is about Colm's. Colm's scheme is Colm's proposal is an excellent one, in my opinion. But it has very good chance of being adopted, which is a bad thing. I wonder how many comparators for it you found in your research. I only know of one, which is in New Zealand, where medical insurance costs, there's a state insurance scheme there, which was introduced about 30 years ago by a committee chaired by a retired judge. It was incredibly controversial, and all the vested interests went crazy, but the New Zealanders are leaders in public finance, and they pressed ahead and they did it. And it has worked pretty much as Colm has set out, because it's not, in fact, the cost of administering the scheme would be less than 0.5% if you do it properly. It could be done at around a quarter, right? But why is it no chance of being accepted? Well, we heard over here, there's a lot of vested interest. Take the insurance scheme. I disagree with you. I think the insurance scheme is all bad. If you cash in your pension into an annuity, you effectively give the insurance company about 30% because they overcharge you so much for doing that. And if that's in this scheme, it's a complete waste of time. So no one should ever be forced to pay an insurance company for an annuity. It's just so much lost money, it is incredible.
Just time-wise, Pat, if you can...
Okay. And the real reason, and the other reason people don't introduce it is the public servants are not experts in finance. And then you have the regulated pension industry. It was so bad, he forced pensioners to buy bonds when they should have been selling them, and therefore ruined the DB schemes.
Okay. Well, winding up with the controversial, I think Jerry and then Des, and then we'll move it for this round and we'll come back.
Jerry Moriarty from the IPF. I think it's great that we've moved on from discussing the concept of auto-enrollment to discussing the detail. Just a couple of questions for Tim around the kind of back to the eligibility. I understand on the 20,000, or whether 20,000 is the right number or not, that there is a point where affordability is a big issue. I do wonder though about the, relying on state pension to be the main replacement rate, because as Laura said, 1 in 6 people don't get full state pension. I would guess that that number is higher for people earning less than 20,000 because they're more likely to have interrupted periods of career. I don't know, I presume you've better data on that. On the 23, I take the point that 75% of those people are kind of full-time students doing part-time jobs, but I would have thought the 20,000 income would take those out anyway, so I'm not sure why you need the 23 there as well. And then just on the, to kind of minimise the cost is obviously hugely important, but also you get the same impact if you maximise the investment return, so you really increase the value of the benefit, and that's why I think Colm's idea is, well worth that investigation. I think it's probably the concept of smoothing can put people off because there have been bad experiences with that in the past. But if you can maximise the investment returns, that's really important as well.
Okay, last question for this round, Des, please.
Just 2 points, Colm. I'm persuaded by your project and your proposal. I just want you to answer one point. I've been involved in hundreds of negotiations on pension schemes. I've been a trustee in a number of them. And you mentioned there in your costings that it would all be based on equities. All equities do have a better return than bonds. But there's always the security issue of having bonds in a pension scheme. It's just a complete departure from that thinking. So I'd like you to explain that. And also looking at historic returns on equities over a number, it doesn't give you an answer to the future because of the uncertainties in the current market system and even today's banking system. So I'd like you to answer that. Second point I would like to make, people may have forgotten, but it wasn't mentioned today, there was a time bomb thrown in my time into the pension system, and that was FRS 17. And that was where, from Britain, we got in from the accountancy profession, a requirement that we departed from the way we calculated pensions and pension entitlements to each individual, and we got this FRS 17, which meant the abolition of the schemes that we had built up over 20 or 30 years of negotiations, which were very good employment-based schemes. They were almost destroyed, they're down to very few, and I remember my union was the only institution in Ireland that actually refused to abide by FRS 17, continued to pay for a defined benefit rather than a defined contribution. That destroyed many of the pensions, and I'm glad Laura Bambrick raised this issue. How is this going to impinge on pre-negotiated schemes, which were healthy, good schemes, and did a very good return for workers. In fact, many people retired and benefit from them. So that's all I would really say, except I don't want the government to go on blindly into that scheme that they have in Britain. It's a disaster. And certainly blindly to reject this debate, and I'm glad this debate is taking place, before you implement. And the fact that Colm's idea is they should at least be teased out, and I'm glad the task is doing it. So let's have this debate and let it continue.
Okay. Well, in fairness now, Tim is here precisely because this is where the debate is. So I think that's it would be unfair to suggest that at least at official level there's anyone ignoring the debate. I'm going to give Tim about 10 minutes to respond, Colm about 5, and then other participants a minute or 2 each if they wish, and then we'll have another round of questions. But at about that time I'm going to sort of officially wind up because we'll be at 1 o'clock then, and people can stay if they want. So.
Okay, well the first thing, thanks very much everybody for the contributions. The first thing I'd like to say is Rosheen would be delighted with me because I did plant trees for my kids when they were born. So I have a big oak and I have a big lime for each of them. Anyway, I'm obviously not good at explaining things, I've discovered. I didn't know that till today, but anyway, you learn something new every day. We have no intention ever of allowing people to go through auto-enrollment for 40 plus years of their lives and end up at the end of it at the mercy of the pensions and insurance industry, no matter how good Maya says they might be. We have no intention of doing that. It has always and ever been intended that there will be a drawdown piece to auto-enrolment that will be within auto-enrolment. That has always been the intention, and that is what we've said in the design document, that we will get to it. We do not believe it's necessary to have that design worked out in detail right now, because no one will be availing of it right now and won't be availing of it for quite some considerable time. When I say innovation in the market, I don't mean in terms of saving people money or anything like that. I'm not so dumb as to believe that the pensions and insurance industry are going to do something wonderful for people or for me because I say it. What I think will happen is that new products and new services will emerge, that we then as the custodians in the CPA, well, I won't be in it because I'll be with Jim analysing policies coming out from government over coffee and things like that. But whoever is in the CPA will be able to work with that and try and mould it into a set of products that will be suitable for people who are customers of AE or participants in it. Not that the industry will do them any favours. So I want people to be absolutely assured there is no intention of letting participants in AE swing in the wind when they get to retirement. The issue about people earning under 20,000 or kids going to college and that kind of thing, the first thing you have to remember is nobody pays PRSI below the threshold of €352 a week. That's north of 18,000 a year. If there are students out there earning over 18,000 a year, well, I have no sympathy for them, off with them. But the ones I know aren't. And I just think it is grossly wrong to impose a 6% levy on them when they're trying to educate themselves and trying to pay for that education. I just think it's grossly wrong. And therefore, it doesn't arise that you're equating it with PRSI, because most of them never get to PRSI in the first place until they go into more full-time work. And PRSI is for an entirely different reason anyway. It's an insurance for contingencies that arise in your working life. It's not about paying necessarily for your pension, although it eventually helps with that when you get there. The UK system is an entirely different system to the Irish one. The UK system is predicated on being employer-centric. The Irish one is predicated on being employee-centric. It's all about making sure that it operates in the best interests of the participants. The one in the UK requires employers to be right at the heart of it and running it. And so this is an entirely different idea. I don't buy the argument that the CPA can't be established and that it'll be more costly than what the private sector would do it, because I've done my sums too. And the reality is we can and we will. And I'll enjoy the glass of champagne with you sometime next year when we do that, and I'll show you the figures then. Risk to diluting good workplace pensions. I think that's a reasonable risk. There's a couple of things that I'd say about it. First of all, and it's important people know this, when we talk about thresholds for enrolment, we're talking about thresholds for automatically enrolling people. We're not talking about thresholds for participation. That's the first thing. So anyone under the age of 23 can be an auto-enrolment. Anyone earning under 20,000 can be an auto-enrolment. Anyone over the age of 60 can join the auto-enrolment scheme. No one is going to be precluded unless they're self-employed. They'll be precluded at the beginning until we work out a solution for them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is nobody is going to be enrolled the day they start a job, because we won't have enough information about them to make a determination about whether they should be enrolled or not. So that won't happen. I said earlier that we will be looking at reference periods, and I mentioned perhaps a quarter being one of those. So after 3 months, we might say, right, that person looks like they should be a participant in auto-enrolment, and so we'll issue an instruction. No employer will be making that decision. None. they will not have that kind of power or authority or discretion. What will happen is the CPA will make that determination based on the information that's available to it and based on the rules that will be set out in the legislation. And the CPA will issue a notification to employers to enrol people. And until such time as that happens, employers wouldn't be able to do anything with the auto-enrollment system. Now the person can. The person could go on to the CPA and say, I'd like to be enrolled, but that's an entirely different matter. That's part of this being an employee-centric system. But no employer will be able to do that. And consequently, and in keeping with the Pensions Council recommendation, this idea of waiting periods is going to disappear anyway from normal occupational schemes. There's no real argument for it anymore. We live in a real-time world, and consequently, pensions have to catch up with the fact that we do live in that world. What this system is going to do is help to get us there a little bit, because it'll make it more the norm. And I expect the Pensions Council recommendation of removing waiting periods to be adopted eventually by government and implemented through the Pensions Act. So that's all going to change over time anyway. I think the issue of women, and this is the last point I'll make, is a really important one. First of all, AE is going to immediately make a decent quality pension arrangement available to about 350,000 women that haven't had that access previously. Not only that, but it's going to result in them being supported in that scheme, in that their employers will be compelled to contribute as well, and so will the state. That's a major step forward, I think. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it hasn't been mentioned this morning, interestingly, but I'll mention it, is stuff around maternity leave and things like that, how women are impacted by that and how their pension pots can be impacted. And it's been suggested AVCs is part of the solution for that, and AVCs aren't going to be available in AE at the beginning. And they're not, in the truest sense of the word. But that doesn't mean that we're not looking at something that could be made available from the beginning that would be akin to an AVC type arrangement. And we're actively working on that right now and consulting with the AG's office on how it might be framed in legislation in a way that also makes it tax compliant. So there's just some intricacies around that, but we're doing our best. And then the last thing is, we're doing a detailed legal analysis of how employers in Ireland can be at least encouraged, if not compelled, to continue making contributions into pension schemes when women take statutory maternity leave. There are serious issues around that don't necessarily arise in the UK jurisdiction in the same way that they do here. But we are actively chasing it to see how best that can be fashioned up. And if we think there are solutions, we will undoubtedly bring them to consultation, because they will require consultation. But they're not AE specific, they're for all schemes. Thanks. And one of these days I'll talk about Colm's.
Thanks indeed. Colm, do you want to react?
Okay, just a few questions that were brought up. One was my belief in the equity risk premium. Well, it's not a belief, it's a fact. And I defer to the economists on my left and on my right for comment about that. Historically, it's been around 4, 5, 6% on average. I was just looking at some stuff I did, a survey of something like 1,000 US economists. They predict an average of 5.5% average in the future. It's very simple. That if I've got a choice of two investments, one's going to give me a guaranteed X% a year, the other I could make a lot of money or I could lose a lot of money. I definitely, if the two of them give the same expected return, I'm talking in mathematical terms, but I'll obviously go for the guaranteed one. So therefore I have to get more from the one that involves risk. It's as simple as that. Historically, over time, it has shown that it is around 4 or 5% a year. Now, obviously there are times when it doesn't, like I showed the first 6 months, but that's precisely in some ways why it has to, because otherwise why would people put money in? So that is a fact. And if you look at things like the Pensions Authority's own website, They say if you're young and you have the time, invest for the long term. Which brings me to the second point. Everyone in this scheme that I'm talking about has a long term, because rather than looking at someone who's 55, they'll be retiring in a few years, but they'll be transferring their funds to someone else. The scheme as a whole has a 50-year plus investment horizon, which brings me back then as well to the whole ESG issue and that too, that if the scheme is constantly looking to a very long-term investment horizon, that it will be trying to say what is the best investment over that sort of time horizon. And the best investment over that horizon will have to take account of all of the issues about what's good for society, what's good for the planet, etc. And I do agree with John that it would be wrong, completely wrong, to sort of say that it is put the money in Ireland only, because you have remember, this is not the state's money or anything like that. This is the members' money that is being entrusted to the, say, directors or whatever. So therefore you have to say, if the members themselves were talking to the investment managers, what would they say to them? Now I know an awful lot of them would say, to be honest, I don't care about ESG and all, give me the highest return possible. Now then you have to educate them and sort of say, well, you have to look very long term on it. But you still have to look at that, and it would mean a very international portfolio. Another point I would say about investment, I think we can get a bit hung up on it, that, you know, looking at the numbers, I've done fairly detailed projections over the long period to try to estimate what the cost might be. And to be honest, the sums involved are very tiny at the very start. In relative terms, they're tiny. So my suggestion, in order to get this thing, and I agree with everyone, we want to get this going as quickly as we possibly can. My suggestion is to start, at the very start, go for a cheap and cheerful, passive, low-cost world equity fund. It charges around 0.1% a year for the first 5 years. Then we can have all of the debate, we can have the navel gazing over what we do in the long term and trying to get, because remember, with the scheme that I'm talking about as well, you could have an awful lot of in unquoted investments and they deliver better in the long term. So you can have that sort of debate, but I'm saying for the start, to get the thing rolling, just go in passive equity funds, and maybe just in passing in that if you go down the road of the scheme as proposed now, there is a monumental problem of defining what a lifestyle fund involves. I mean, there's been a debate, and Brendan Burgess mentioned about asking about money there a while ago, that there's all sorts of things. The people now who thought they were in lifestyle funds last year, right? With, you know, they said, oh gosh, you're coming up to retirement. They suffered a drop of 20% or more in their funds when they thought they were gone safe, because of the fact that they'd been put into long bonds. And so there's all that question now about what happens with that. You avoid that completely with the thing I've done. You've no problem about investment strategy that you put 100% in equities all the time. And maybe taking Des's question there, which is, well, you know, maybe should be maybe 80% or something rather than 100%. I note your point, but remember, if you have got a very long-term, 50-year plus investment horizon, and you have that for every single cent in the fund, well, then you say, well, I want to put every cent to try to invest it for the longest possible term. And I know that in the long term, while there might be all sorts of gyrations in the short term, in the long term, real investments will pay the better return. Absolutely, and that is the advice to everyone.
Thank you very much, Colm. So at this stage, I'm going to wind up on behalf of Task, but I think if people are willing, we'll stay and continue the discussion. But just as some of you will want to leave it being 1 o'clock, Task was delighted to be part of this debate. It's a real, it is full of issues of equity, inequality, and therefore very much the Task's point. Task is a voluntary charity. It requires some support. It requires support in two ways: donations, but also in terms of people giving it work to do that they are willing to pay for in terms of projects. So please bear that in mind when you go back to your offices. Thank you all very much, and those of you who want to stay for a few minutes longer, please take 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll go.
Directed towards the Safety Connect Trade Union, and I welcome the commitment that the drawdown will come from the scheme, because I did have reservations about if it went to the market, because it costs 24,000 to buy 1,000 euro annuity at the moment. So you're going to get 25. You know, so it doesn't make sense when the average person earns this 82.2 years. As regards younger people, though, because this thing about voluntary enrolment, that's not really fair to younger people, because I came here to listen to auto-enrolment and what the parameters are for auto-enrolment. If you leave it voluntary, everything just volunteer. Young people, not put aside the third level students that people may have sympathy for, just almost 30,000 apprentices in the system in Ireland at the moment. That's to grow to 50,000 by 2030. Second year apprentice at the moment in the trades will round up to 24,000. So you could be an 18-year-old or 17-year-old or 24,000. You know, the final apprentice rate for a fourth year apprentice is 46,000. So in the trade, so you could be looking at somebody 19 years of age earning that money. So the young people should be, and that, by the way, the actual pension plan, the government's apprenticeship action plan has they want to get to a situation where instead of currently having, they started out with 25 traditional craft trades, there's something like 43 different apprenticeships now. You want to get to German figure of 230 something different apprenticeships in the country. So there's going to be more and more young people using alternative route education who will be paid. So I think we have to look at that age, and people should be auto-enrolled. It's auto-enrollment we're talking about, and the age should be lowered because there are people out there earning quite good money, certainly in the people we represent, right? So I welcome that the commitment to the drawdown staying in the system, and I would like to get the same commitment that the auto-enrollment age will come down to someone who's working.
Then this one, and then this chap.
Hey, thank you very much, and look, Michelle, Smart Bricks here. I just have one question in relation to how this is going to interact with occupational pensions. It's probably going to be different tax regimes. So we're talking about a 6 and 6 and 2. So with the state being explicit with an auto-enrollment. Now, obviously, within occupational pensions schemes, the is implicit within the tax regime. So my question is, do we envisage that the ultimate minimum standards for occupational pension plans are going to be that same 14% total, and then I guess in terms of how those minimum standards will work, would that be an income related scale and then based on the tax in terms of what has to go in, or is that all TBD, I guess, at this point in time?
I'm Miriam from Age Action, and I'm stealing a question that came from the first round that kind of fell through the cracks a bit, and I'm quite curious about, which I think the person might have left, but they made the they raised the question about, well, if we accept that the vast majority of workers under the age of 23 are full-time students or aren't earning a level where they would be attracting PRSI anyway, why is the requirement of the 23 necessary? Because you already have the requirement of the 20,000 income level. So why not just get rid of the 23, and most people, like full-time students, will already be excluded because they're not going to be earning the 20,000. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
It's the same as the second to last question, which is just what is because the draft legislation says if you don't have a qualifying occupation pension, what is the qualifying occupation pension?
Now, what I'm going to do is maybe let other panelists comment on anything they want to comment on. No?
Yeah, I suppose just to echo, and I suppose we're coming from the same parish, myself and Paddy, saying about, you know, it's great that the legislation allows those that won't be automatically captured to voluntarily opt in, you know, those that are under 23 or under 20,000. Well, if people were proactive about sorting out their future pension, we wouldn't be here today. There wouldn't need to be an auto-enrolment. And when you have that apprentice, as Paddy set out, earning that money, then when they come into the 23 age bracket, at that stage, having been used to 5-6 years of a full wage, then having 6%, that's another income cliff again, like that 20,000 euro worker, that if they go for promotion and get extra hours. So we did hear from certain speakers talking about, let's not make the same mistakes as the UK. Ireland is the last of the OECD countries to have a mandatory pay-related pension. There's a whole world out there. We have late mover advantage. And if we look at other countries and we ask them, what would you do again if you had your time over? It's always around the age and the income thresholds. And this really has to be fleshed out. And I know we'll have the opportunity as the bill goes through the Oireachtas, but I really think we have to more engagements with the department on this, and especially that point, why are they both needed? Why is 23 needed if the income is it doubling up unnecessary? Thanks.
Thank you. Tom?
one point. I can fully understand that Tim and colleagues, having laboured on this for 20 years, got government agreement on a scheme, we're nearly there, finds it completely very difficult to look at an alternative scheme at this stage. I fully understand that. It seems to me that Colm's option is potentially a much more attractive and it is a credible option. I think the department, looking at the values that should inform public service, have a public service responsibility to get this thing checked out independently. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it does work, we're all better off.
Okay, one question from that gentleman, and then I have a question, and then I'm going to come back to Colm.
So this is an actual question. I'm hoping for an answer. Stephen Lawler, Irish Institute of Pensions Management, I think. I hate to be the person picking on Tim, but you mentioned that the 20,000 was an indicative figure, and that you'd look at measuring it over a shorter period, perhaps even quarters. How would that work?
Okay, so that'll be for Tim. So, Colm, I have a question.
Yeah,
because it sounds so good, and it sounds almost as good as most Ponzi schemes, and that's not. I know that's not what it is, but and the reason I'm trying to think, why does it sound too good to be true? And the reason I think it sounds too good to be true is that what you're proposing is an enormous all-in national bet on a single asset class, and it's a single asset class that you say for the last 100 years. Gung-ho, always good over any 10-year cycle, and yet you can have wars, nuclear disasters, climate change. Why would we make an enormous national bet on a single asset class?
Okay, well, Kevin, good question. Well, first, I think I should say the word, and in the paper I've used the word inequity in inverted commas, right? So it is all asset classes that are that have a risk element, right, which means you expect to deliver that extra return. And that's what I say, at any point in time, as I said, the economist, I'll defer more to the economist, if you're looking at one investment that gives you absolute guarantee, everything certain, and another investment with risk, you go for the, if you go for the one with risk, you have to expect a higher return, always, right? You won't, of course, get it. You'll often be disappointed. And I'm saying the very long-term horizons on this, is that, so in terms of I see infrastructure, for instance, as a major type of investment that will go into this, because remember that there's only the way I've proposed this is only 1% weighting to market value at any time. There is because market values eventually have to rule. So therefore, you can have, because there's no sale of assets, etc., you can invest very long-term things. You don't have to be able to measure a market value every day. It literally is every day. That's my 10,000 valuations a year is not an exaggeration. It is the way these damn things work. And the government will have to have all these default funds, all these valuations, because that's the way the system, and when you think of it, I mean, this is madness for a scheme that is going on, that is going to continue getting money forever, or for at least the next 30, 40 years.
Yeah, but so that's a detail, because honestly, that's the sort of thing that insurance companies are doing every day, market to market on a daily basis. It's not that big a deal. It's a small team in a big company. What's really important is the choice of asset class, and you're saying choose risk assets, real assets. Fair enough. When you say, because you have to expect that will do better in the long term.
I'd probably refer to John Miller more than anyone.
You have to expect it, but it doesn't have to happen.
Sorry, it doesn't have to happen for any particular class, and you could have 10 years, 20 years. And I said I did look at what happened if there was the time after the crisis after the dot-com boom in 2000. The market absolutely crashed and it stayed down.
What happened in 1940?
What? Actually, as it happens, equities are, because of the fact that people are always pricing these assets to deliver that return of risk-free plus. And I say, I've looked at as long as I possibly can. I couldn't look at monthly returns I didn't have the data over that long period, but just a quick high-level analysis, it would always have worked for the UK-US market. Now, Japan was a problem, there's no doubt. Post-1990, the reason Japan was a problem, though, was not so much of the initial crash after 1990, but the fact that it was so high. I mean, you had the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was supposed to be worth more than the entire state of California. And the second thing about it was the authorities in Japan handled it so badly because they kept zombie banks and zombie companies going for decades. or more afterwards, and that caused an awful lot of the problem. John.
Pat has the answer.
No, I was going to say, if I were running this fund on behalf of myself, I might do what Colm suggests, but this is one area where I do disagree with Colm's proposal. I think this should be managed, if it were to be done, exactly as the National Pensions Reserve Fund was managed. And that fund was spread globally. It had 2% assets in Ireland. It had a good lot of equities, and it had a fair share of fixed income as well, and all various other things, including derivatives and everything you get in a modern pension fund. So that's the one area where I'd probably disagree with Colm.
Comments? Yes, please.
Just a question for Tim, if you don't mind. You mentioned there that it won't be auto-enrollment won't be an IOR. Do you have any other details that you can share on that? And is there a risk that policyholders of AE might be negatively impacted through a lower kind of regulatory burden? Thank you.
Take one more question then, Tim. Yes.
I was just going to make a comment back to the previous discussion. I think a lot of the debate went into what the pot of assets would be. I think the point of the proposal, as I read it, was around the smoothing of it. So the idea being that these customers really need to be in what you might call real assets, so they generate a return above inflation. And that's really important. That's a really important principle here. Whether it's, a mixed pot, that you'd see in traditional managed funds, that pension assets all over the world are being invested in, or all equity or whatever, is a point of debate. But the issue here is whether there is an opportunity here with a state-funded scheme to smooth that return, so that those customers who have probably the least tolerance for the volatility that comes arising from those real assets, that they have the opportunity to participate and share that burden. I suppose, we've heard a lot of comments about insurance and all of that. Insurance origin is back in the 1500s, and the principle was the sharing of risk. That's where it came from in the first place. Maybe it hasn't always manifested itself in that premise. But I think this is a proposal that is worthy of being looked at from that point of view. It is about the sharing of risk.
Okay, thanks. And the last hand I saw was Brendan, so we'll close it with Brendan's question and we'll let the panel respond.
At the moment, 90% of people who are in retirement own their own home. And the ESRI has estimated that on current trends, 50% of people aged between 27 and 35 will end up renting for life, will not own their own home. And this proposal, where you're taking 8% of somebody's net income in their 20s and 30s, will make that even worse. You cannot bring in an auto-enrollment system where you effectively force people who would otherwise be saving for their home to put money into that system without allowing them access to that system by way of being able to borrow that money as a deposit for their home. If you do that, you will have a very successful auto-enrollment system. If you don't do that, people are going to exit from the auto-enrollment system. I've touched that before, and a bit like Colm's scheme, not really interested, but it will be brought in at some stage. Mine can wait, Colm's can't.
Okay, that's a very good point, Brendan, that over the course of a life cycle there's different ways of saving. Some of it is in investing in, but when you pay your mortgage, you're investing in not paying rent in your old age. When you invest in your kids' education, you're investing in not needing a pension in your old age. You hope. So there's a lot of different ways of saving that have to be taken into account, but I think there's been very little discussion, no one here has demurred from the notion that we don't have adequate pension savings, and that has to be addressed. So, last comments, anyone want to?
I'll take Brendan's one.
Just to fully agree with Brendan Burns, when I got interested in this, I was attracted by the Central Provident Fund in Singapore. You can draw down for housing and indeed health, which I think is something that needs to be looked at.
And education.
Can I have the counterpoint on that? So we know from New Zealand, who also allowed younger people or anybody to draw down for the housing, that while they have coverage, they don't have adequacy because people are drawing it down for each way. And the Irish Congress and Trade Union are quite sure that this is a pension retirement saving. And other than fatal illness, there's nobody's getting their dibs on it. Now, if we look at the continent, we see that they have higher levels of renters entering retirement, but they don't have high levels of retired homeless people. Now, they do have better renting protections, but the reason for that is people have an income-related retirement, so they're still able to pay their rent. So it's a false to say that, yes, we are going to have more people, this generation, entering retirement without an asset. But if you have a pay-related pension, you will still be able to pay those rents, assuming that you have the renter's protection. But it's not a one or other. And as I said about looking at other countries, New Zealand is a case in point, where we allowed people access their pension fund, and they had a pension, but they don't have adequacy, and we have to learn from that mistake.
So I'm going to let Tim wrap up, and then any other discussion has to happen at the cups of tea at the back.
Okay. 20k over shorter periods. All I mean there is that we will try and use shorter reference periods than 12 months, because you'd have to wait 12 months to determine that somebody had earned 20k. So we'll look at a quarter and see have they earned 5,000 over the last 13 weeks, and we keep rolling the 13 weeks, right? So we'll do something like that. And if that's true, then we'll automatically enroll them and issue an instruction to their employer. And that way we get them in faster, and it's likely that we won't make a gross mistake, you know, that they'll just earn for the 13 weeks and then they won't earn any more for the rest of the year. Otherwise you are stuck with the year-long thing. The deposit on the home, we used to have a bereavement grant once upon a time, 850 notes, and the minute it disappeared in 2013, all funeral expenses dropped by roughly about 800 notes. If you allow everyone in the country to access 20, 30 grand, and every developer in the country knows that they can access the 20, 30 grand, guess what's going to happen? And then there's Laura's point, which I absolutely agree with. New Zealand has become a basket case in terms of the adequacy of those pension pots that are in auto-enrollment.
It's only two-thirds of, there's 3 million people enrolled and only 2 million contributing in New Zealand.
Yeah, but they're also not contributing enough, and it's getting lower and lower and lower. So, we did look at all these other systems. We've learned the lessons. If you do that, you will result in big problems when it comes to what the product is supposed to be about in the first place. There are other ways to solve the housing issue, and that's what needs to be looked at rather than trying.
For your next job.
Yeah, next job, right. But this can't be the solution to housing. Right. So now the 23, right? It's a reasonable point, right? The 23 and the 20 were in the original straw man document. I think the 20 still holds up. There's less argument for the 23 since we changed how we're going to do it, right? Far less burden on employers and employments from the straw man arrangement that was originally touted. So you could get rid of the 23, but only if you maintained the 20. And what I think people are arguing for is both to be gone. And if that was to happen, then I think that will cause very significant difficulties. I agree with the idea of apprentices, especially if they're earning that kind of money. I'm really glad I got my son to fill in a number of apprentice application forms over the weekend, given that kind of earnings. But I kind of agree. But the difficulty for us in setting the law is that to capture those apprentices, we have to compel 400,000 people into auto-enrollment that just will not be earning enough money to be in the thing in the first place. And so that's the trade-off. Now what I would say to you is, let's go ahead with the 20,000. And what we've built into the design is we will keep this under review, and we will keep either not doing anything with it, in which case it becomes a thing of nothing anyway, because inflation will take care of it. Or we will say this needs to be changed, and we'll have a set of reasons, and we'll also have a set of mitigations for those who might be inadvertently, incorrectly trapped in it. standards for occupational schemes. So what we don't find, in the same way that Laura is concerned that this might undermine occupational schemes, I'd be slightly concerned that occupational schemes could undermine auto-enrolment. So what we'd be saying is your ability to be exempt from auto-enrolment will be that you will not get a lesser arrangement outside of auto-enrolment. So now we haven't landed on the criteria yet. I think in the beginning, all we'll be checking is, are you making contributions into an auto-enrolment scheme? And we won't be checking the level of contributions, because the level of contributions into auto-enrolment is going to be relatively low anyway. And God help you if you're contributing into an occupational scheme at a lower rate than what AE is going to start with. You're not in the scheme at all, you know. But eventually we will actually set out what those standards are going to be. And there is a distinct likelihood that it will be, you must be contributing. There must be a contribution equivalent to a minimum of 14% into your pension pot per annum. Now, how that's made up is an entirely different matter. And if you have one of those fantastic employers that does it all, then way hey hey. So that's where we're likely to go, but it needs to be teased out. And I do want to engage in a kind of a consultation on that before landing on it. But it's not needed day one.
Thank
So
you.
that's that.
Thank you all very much for staying a few minutes. I think it was worth it for me, certainly. And thank you to all the panelists, to Rosheen, Jim, Colm in particular. The others won't mind me saying so well done.